So thank you all for coming out tonight, and we're very glad to see all of you here for what will certainly be a very enjoyable event on werewolves and fainting damsels. The genius and challenges of genre fiction. I'm holding back all sorts of jokes, by the way. So we're delighted to have two very talented authors here tonight, Eleanor Bourg Nicholson and my lovely wife, Rhonda Ortiz. And we'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Religion Department, and especially the Corpus Christi Foundation, who has a table in the back so you can learn more about their good work. So as many of you know, Catholic arts and letters are experiencing something of a renaissance. In recent years, we've seen a proliferation of artists, authors, publishers, architects, MFA programs, journals, and more that have reclaimed the noble heritage of the Catholic artistic tradition for a new generation. Central to this renaissance is the novel, and if I may be so bold, the popular novel. My wife and I have talked often about Flannery O'Connor, who we both love, and every Catholic in our generation is in some ways taught to love Flannery O'Connor, and let's be honest, she's pretty lovable. But recently, we've wondered, what would Flannery O'Connor's mother, Regina, have read? She was a faithful Catholic, but Flannery's stories, with their Southern grotesques and grace-filled violence, were certainly not to her Southern refined tastes. So, WWRR, what would Regina read? So, while high literature, of course, is important, we cannot forget the place and power of popular fiction. So the popular novel, with its many genre forms, is what most people read and has the power to reach a wide variety of people. And that's why I am so delighted that we have these two talented authors here tonight who are steeped in the literary tradition, as you will hear, not to mention the philosophical and theological tradition. But they bring their great learning to bear in superbly crafted novels that aim at a general audience. So, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. So first, Eleanor Bourg Nicholson with baby Esther Nicholson. Has done many, many things, but just a few highlights. She's edited a number of critical editions, Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, and Bram Stoker's Dracula. With that profile, I think the next critical edition should be Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. She's also the author of two truly excellent novels, A Bloody Habit, about a Dominican priest who tracks and exorcises vampires, and her latest novel, Brother Wolf, about Franciscan werewolves. So I've read both of these novels and have loved both of them. Rhonda Ortiz has the misfortune of being married to me. But as I often tell her, suffering is good for art. And so Rhonda's been writing for a long time, blogs, spiritual meditations, practical articles, personal essays. 10 years ago, when we were living in Oregon, before we came to Hope College, God gave her a story idea. She had never written fiction before, and her fiction career began. When we came here to Hope, she took a novel writing class with Beth Tremblay, which oriented her toward the world of craft. And after many years of disciplined writing, Rhonda's first book, In Pieces, came out this month. And I should add that she wrote the complete first draft of this while she was pregnant with our fifth child, and completed the edits while raising all five at home. So I've been very inspired by her discipline. So tonight, Eleanor and Rhonda will give a joint presentation. Afterward, there will be time for questions. There are also books for sale, which our authors will be glad to sign. So please help me welcome Eleanor Bourg Nicholson and Rhonda Ortiz.
All right, well, thank you very much for your warm welcome. And thanks, Jared, for putting up with years of suffering in return. Being married to a writer is not easy. All right, let's see if I can make this thing work. Hold on. Oh, there we go. Sorry, this is like my first time. All right. Really quick, we're very happy to be with you to talk about one of our favorite topics, genre. A quick overview of the talk. We will be looking at 3 genres specifically tonight. We will be looking at murder mysteries, romance, and the Gothic. I'll start us off by defining terms. Eleanor and I are both third-order Dominicans, and she says that beginning with defining our terms is very Dominican of us. Eleanor will jump in to discuss how genres develop over time. I will specifically with the mystery genre. I'll discuss romance as one who writes in the genre, and Eleanor will do the same with the Gothic. And then Eleanor will conclude with some big picture thoughts. And so long as we don't lapse into excitable rambling, we ought to have time for questions at the end. All right, so what do we mean by genre? And for the sake of this talk, Eleanor and I are going to use the common definition of genre, that is, the story's content. So is it a romance? Is it a psychological thriller? Is it a Western? Is it a war story, science fiction? When most people use the word genre, this is what they're referring to, the story's subject matter. But genre, just as a side note, can also refer to the way we categorize stories more broadly. So its overall form. And not only in addition to its content, we can also discuss its style, its length, the reality it takes, so if it's a realism, it's fantasy, if it's absurdism, and we can also discuss its plot structure. So, and I love the inclusivity of this broader definition because it acknowledges almost a infinite range of storytelling possibilities. But for tonight, we are going to stick to the narrower definition. Genre is the content of a story. And just as a side note, genre fiction is a term that you often will hear. Sometimes it's used pejoratively to describe pulp fiction. And by pulp fiction, I mean, in my genre, that would be anything with Fabio, like naked on the cover, okay? That's pulp fiction. And we acknowledge its existence. However, just saying this, we will not be taking the pejorative view tonight because all stories have a form, all stories have genre, and no story is really exempt from the law of genre, and it's just a matter of what an author does with it. All right, and the next term we have is genre conventions, and conventions are the elements that must be present in a story in order to tell it well. And these are and this is specifically with regard to its genre, with regard to its content. Conventions have developed over time. Occasionally, we'll see a story where the author will experiment with a convention, either pushing against it, they'll flip it, they'll break it. And if they do so successfully, it can lead to further development of the genre. And we see the influence of key authors along the way whose stories are so good that they act as touchstones for future stories and shape reader expectations. And Eleanor will come back to this momentarily with the mystery genre. So if you've ever read a story, as readers, you've ever read a story and thought, wow, there is something missing. This story, it didn't meet my expectations. It's quite possible that the author fell short or even omitted one of the genre conventions. So like, you know, if you look up here, you say, for example, a murder mystery always involves a dead body. If there is no body, we have no murder mystery. Okay, this is Captain Obvious reporting for duty. Okay, but, so, you know, you need a dead body in order to have a murder mystery. In cases where the author is experimenting with an established convention, the convention itself is still assumed, okay? So authors who are playing around with conventions are still working with them, even if they are playing around with them. Next term are obligatory scenes. And so this is, again, as readers, you'll see this. You'll see these scenes common in each genre. Each genre has their own kind of obligatory scenes, things that you expect. And writers have to kind of look and make sure, did I meet all the expectations? And they are recognizable, generic scenes that can play out in a myriad of ways, limited only by the author's skill and imagination. And these scenes are obligatory for good reason. Again, take, for example, the discovery of the body scene in a murder mystery, that necessary dead body. This scene must happen early in the story, preferably by the 10 to 15% mark, and certainly no later than the quarter mark. Why? Because the question that drives every single murder mystery that has ever been written is, who done it? And the sleuth and the other characters want the answer to this question, and they take action to find it. If this is what the story is about, then the dead body needs to be on the page early so that the whodunit can begin. Just as an example, Jared recently read a book, title, author, and publishing house shall remain nameless, which was advertised as a murder mystery and had what seemed to be an interesting kind of academic-y premise. However, the dead body took its sweet time showing up on the page. And he was just reading, no body, no body, no body. And Jared kept turning to me and saying, I see what you mean about plot conventions. You know, there's nothing happening on this book. And finally, in the last quarter of the book, the dead body makes an appearance. And so this was a disappointment. It was a disappointing read because it didn't meet the expectation, the genre expectation. A trope, on the other hand, so you have conventions and you have tropes. A trope, on the other hand, is an archetype, setting, plot device, etc., that frequently occurs in a particular content genre, but is not obligatory. Conventions, obligatory; tropes, optional. And this distinction is pure Ortiz, by the way. I have yet to hear anyone define the difference quite so succinctly, but this is the difference that makes sense to me. This is what I see. Okay, so this is my definition. The thing to know about tropes, and as a reader and as writers, is that they happen. And you can make a bumper sticker, tropes happen. Maybe some authors use tropes on purpose. For me, I'm just writing along ho-hum and like, oh, look, I wrote another trope. Look at there. And given the sheer number of tropes that have developed from the beginning of time, it's practically impossible to write or find a story that doesn't have at least a handful of them. Okay, and now I'm hearing the objection. But genre fiction is so formulaic because they have conventions and tropes. Isn't that bad? And to that I say, is there bad genre fiction out there? Yeah. But conventions and tropes aren't to blame for a lackluster story. If I write a crappy sonnet, which I would, we don't blame the sonnet form. It's not the 14-line structure that makes my poem bad. My sonnet stinks because I am an unpracticed poet. Same with genre conventions and tropes. What makes any story compelling depends entirely on the breadth and depth of the author's skill and imagination. An old trope in the hand of a talented writer will seem fresh and new. And so I have up here, I have The Big Lebowski. This is a Coen Brothers movie. I watched it 25 years ago. I didn't like it then. I haven't watched it since, so don't ask me for the details of the plot. But the really interesting thing about The Big Lebowski is that it's a private eye story. And so when we think of private eyes, we think of Humphrey Bogart wearing his fedora and sitting at his desk in a smoke-filled office, and in walks Mary Astor as the femme fatale dame with a case, and instead, in The Big Lebowski, you have Jeff Bridges in a bowling alley, right? And so it follows all of the conventions, it follows all the tropes for a private eye, but the setting and the characters, the archetypal setting and characters are different. So this is why the Coen Brothers are the Coen Brothers. They just do things like this, and it makes it interesting. Now, sometimes one encounters writers with lofty writing goals who think that genre rules do not and should not apply to their work, that they are above conventions. And I will argue that this is simply not the case. Conventions become conventions for a reason. Conventions and tropes reflect perennial truths and the universal human story, which is really interesting. So take, for example, the central question of every murder mystery, who done it? What is the deeper meaning of who done it? The answer is every murder mystery points to humanity's universal search for truth and justice in a broken world. That's the deeper meaning of whodunit. And for whatever reason, the archetypal characters and plot devices in a murder mystery, as they've developed over time, resonate as appropriate and even necessary to the depiction of this search for justice. And so this is why conventions, just as a subject within the genres, matter deeply, because people tell these kinds of stories. They tell stories within forms. And when they do that, you start collecting a body of knowledge, and you start collecting these expectations, and they tap into something greater than ourselves. The conventions do. So even in literary and experimental forms of fiction, the writer must be aware of conventions and know how to employ them. If a writer breaks a convention, if he's experimenting, he had better know what he's doing. He simply needs to know what he's doing. It's not that you can't, it's that you need to know what you're doing. I'm going to turn over to Eleanor.
All right, following on what Rhonda has established, if we look at the golden age of detective fiction, which took place in the early part of the 20th century, it's a case in point. Many of the most talented writers of detective fiction talked about conventions and tropes. They engaged in conventions and tropes. They manipulated conventions and tropes, and even discussed what you could or could not do in a mystery novel. In 1929, a Catholic priest named Ronald Knox composed the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments of detective fiction. And he defined the genre thus: detective fiction, quote, must have as its main interest the unraveling of a mystery whose elements are clearly presented to the reader at an early stage in the proceedings, and whose nature is such as to arouse curiosity, a curiosity which is gratified at the end. And I will let the 10 Commandments of Ronald Knox speak for themselves. Many of these are very interesting, very fun to unpack. I teach high schoolers, and they get very excited about these, especially determining which ones they would like to break in a mystery novel. And in fact, they're in very good company. In 1930, Agatha Christie, E.C. Bentley, Dorothy L. Sayers, G.K. Chesterton, Ronald Knox, and a host of others started the Detection Club. What did they do but set out to break every single one of Ronald Knox's commandments? And they had a grand time doing it. Their unfolding engagement really strikes at the heart of what we're saying here, and what we could say about the mystery genre, the questions that are at its heart and at its origin in its popularity. Is detective fiction more about plot and character, or is it a logical puzzle? Is the reader supposed to be able to solve it? There's Ronald Knox's sister, I was telling Rhonda, she wrote mystery novels as well. She stops the book and has a little box that says, you have all the clues, can you solve it? Very distracting, by the way. Is the detective a transcendent genius, or is he fallible? Can he be wrong? Can the Watson be smarter than the Sherlock? How many doubles is too many doubles? Who started the mystery genre anyway, Edgar Allan Poe or Wilkie Collins? This is a life and death fight, my friends. It was Collins. Anyway, can you have a murder mystery without a dead body? Highly problematic here. Does the detective have to share all the clues? Can he keep one critical clue back? Is detection an art or a science? All of these are deep in the heart of this genre at this time. Is it both? And why wasn't Arthur Conan Doyle ever the president of the Detection Club? because he actually didn't like Sherlock Holmes. He was a spiritualist, should have written Gothic novels. What are the potential gains here? You could have a fascinating mystery. You could do something really new and exciting. What is the risk? The risk is you could write a dud, and many of them did. And this is from Dorothy L. Sayers in her amazing speech, Aristotle on Detective Fiction, which I highly recommend if you can find a copy. Quote, even though at the end we are to feel surprise on discovering the identity of the criminal, we ought not to feel incredulity. We should rather be able to say to ourselves, yes, I can see now that from the beginning this man had it in him to commit murder, and had I only the wits to interpret the indications furnished by the author, I could have discovered him in it. I would agree that this sentiment, with or without murder, underlies our appreciation or our dissatisfaction in a novel, even the most literary, in its use of conventions and tropes. Back to Rhonda.
The love story. Especially the courtship story, ranks among the most frequently occurring story types in all fiction, past and present. Non-romance stories will often feature a love story as a supporting plot. And the love story genre conventions point to universal human desire to love and be loved, and the divine romance between God and man, and ultimately the inner life of the Holy Trinity, love to love. The human race is obsessed with love stories, and I think this is the wonderful thing. It does begin. I mean, you look at the Bible, right? We've got God creating the world, and then what do we have next? The creation of man, of Adam and Eve, and Adam's declaration. This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and this continues down through the literary ages, both East and West. And not only do romances saturate today's market, but again, that the love story is often used as a supporting plot in books that are not romances. So two quick examples, quick and easy examples. Robert Ludlum's spy thriller, The Bourne Identity, has the love story. This is the novel, well, the movie too, but the love story between Jason Bourne and Marie Saint-Jacques. Another quick example, Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, an American musical. The central story of Hamilton is Hamilton's ambition. I'm not going to throw away my shot. Yet, its marriage story, which is the supporting plot line, it's the marriage story that shapes Hamilton's character arc and therefore shapes the course of his ambition. And eventually, as we know, he does throw away his shot. I do have critiques of the love story in Hamilton. You can always talk to me afterward. Romance genre conventions, I just want to put these up on the screen, and so you can just take a look at them. With regard to universals, again, this is the love story is pointing to the human need to love and be loved. It's pointing to the divine love story between God and fallen man. And we see this reflected in the love story conventions and obligatory scenes. And this, by the way, is a handy list from a podcast done years ago by, there's a veteran industry editor named Sean Coyne, who's written a couple books and does things. I cannot find the podcast, so I can't give you the reference. But in any case, and if you look at this, the obligatory scenes are effectively a story outline. And the conventions are a sort of Mad Libs game for the cast of characters, the plot premise, and the theme. Nobody writes like this, but you can actually, you could do a Mad Libs game if you really wanted to. I'd like to highlight a few of these conventions. The first one I would like to highlight, and because we're going to come back to it, is the proof of love. And this is the moment in a love story when all hope is lost, and one of the lovers sacrifices him or herself in a meaningful way for the good of the other without expectation of reward. So big self-sacrifice. It always happens in a love story. If it doesn't happen, it's not a very good love story. And sometimes the proof of love is the willingness to literally die for your beloved. More often, it's a figurative death. So take a very classic example, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. The proof of love in Pride and Prejudice is when Mr. Darcy hunts down Mr. Wickham, the arch enemy, and cajoles and bribes the scoundrel into marrying Lydia Bennet, Elizabeth Bennet's silly youngest sister. For Darcy, this is an act of extreme self-abnegation. He does it in secret, and he does it solely for Elizabeth's sake. The second convention I'd like to highlight is the need for moral weight. And this is present, the need for moral weight is present both in romantic comedy and serious drama alike. Coyne, again, the maker of this list, explains it this way. He says, if the lovers cannot elevate themselves morally, they will not be able to find authentic love. Oh, that sounds true to life, doesn't it? That is, they must have a worldview shift within the course of the story that raises their moral fiber. Love makes us better people. It should. In Pride and Prejudice, you guessed it, if the two central lovers do not overcome their pride and prejudice, they won't be able to properly love one another. So love requires self-reflection and change. Sweet talk and roses mean nothing without moral elevation. So I will be returning to those in a moment. This list is hysterical. If you've ever been to tvtropes.org, if you want to waste an hour of your life, this is fun. When I went to TV Tropes. It's a wiki site where people put this stuff up. I went and looked at the romance genre, and I copy-pasted the entire list into Word. At 10-point Garamond, the list is 13 pages long. You cannot write a love story without tropes. It is impossible. Good luck, 13 pages. All right, and as you know, people have really strong feelings about love, sex, and gender roles. Okay, newsflash. And older stories often depict a large degree of passivity on the part of the heroine. So once again, we end up with this kind of problem with tropes. Okay, and this is specifically, it's a sort of, what do you do with a trope that you don't really like? And once again, to take Pride and Prejudice as an example, Elizabeth's primary act of active agency, when she does something in the story, is during the first proposal scene, when she tells Darcy in no uncertain terms what she thinks of him, the jerk. Otherwise, she's mostly sitting around waiting for life to happen. Not entirely, but mostly. And I can easily understand why people today would be bothered by this. And we make allowances for Austen because those were the constraints of her story world. But Austen's world is not our world. While Austen, as a woman author and an English gentlewoman, felt compelled to publish her novels anonymously, tonight you have two women authors sitting in front of you, talking openly about their books and the theory behind them. And for your sakes, I wish Jane Austen were here. She would have been far more qualified to talk about romance genre conventions, being the woman whose work solidified said conventions. We all read and write and watch movies in the shadow of Elizabeth and Darcy, Emma Woodhouse and George Knightley, and Anne Elliot and Frederick Wentworth. So the trope pairing, however, that really, really gets people's dander up is the one we all know. The damsel in distress and the knight in shining armor. So come on, look at Robin sweeping her off her feet. What's wrong with that? It's not the like. And so people get really upset about this, and people get really upset about these romance tropes because it plays into a lot of stereotypes. And as much as these tropes ultimately image our deep need for a divine savior, they don't always quite cut it for contemporary realistic fiction. They're fine for a fun, fluffy read, but we're also kind of jaded. You see writers and movie makers pushing the opposite trope, action girl. Action girl? You watch a movie, and you're like, all of a sudden there's this girl, we were talking about this girl who knows kung fu, and you're like, how did you beat up this guy who's like twice your size and also knows kung fu? That doesn't make any sense. But action girl is a trope, and she's the opposite of damsel in distress. But the thing is that, especially with realistic fiction, the point is that we want our heroines to be a little bit more of little bit more than a damsel, a little less of a damsel, a little more of action girl. And we want our heroes to be a little more human and a little less of a romantic ideal. And yet, romance authors still employ these two tropes. It's almost as if they can't help themselves. In fact, a few weeks ago, someone put out a historical romance, came out on the market, in which these are the central premise. I went there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this trope and talk about this. I want to preface this a little bit by saying I don't think about my book in terms of tropes I didn't think about it really in terms of tropes until about a week ago. I was like, oh. So a little bit about the book. In Pieces, this is the first installment of Molly Chase. The series is called Molly Chase, which is a historical continuity series. It features romance, family drama, society drama, political suspense, and lots of humor. It's set in 1793 Boston. For those of you who like history, that is George Washington's second term. It's not long after the ratification of the Constitution, therefore. The story opens 8 weeks after Molly Chase, the main character, finds her father's dead body in his study. Her father committed suicide in a very gruesome way, and she is the one who found him. Her childhood friend and merchant sailor, Josiah Robb, arrives home from sea, discovers her in the throes of what we know to be a PTSD flashback. He takes her home to be cared for by his mother, Sarah Robb, and his sister, Deborah, and the story goes from there. And it all sounds very serious, and it is. In Pieces also has a great active plot, and spies, politics, chase scenes, fights in hidden alleys, that sort of thing. Molly and Josiah have a teasing kind of sibling-like relationship. That's a lot of fun. Josiah has definitely retained what is a very common and sometimes annoying boyhood habit of teasing the girl he likes. If you've ever been on a school playground, you know what that is. And so, so this is, speaking of tropes, think Anne Shirley and Gilbert Blythe from Anne of Green Gables. But the point is that this is a story where the premise of the book is the damsel in distress and the knight in shining armor. Molly is traumatized, angry at her father, and ill. Or as Josiah says, addled, right? And that would be a good 18th century term. And Josiah, as an old friend, an ardent though undeclared lover, his teasing she's not quite caught on to this fact. And he is also a type A problem solver, wants to rescue her. But then it turns out that you can't just do that. PTSD is not a problem that the knight in shining armor can solve. And so here we have this, you set up this trope, you set up a story, we've got the tropes at play, and then you enter into the reality of the world. And so the trope flips. And what happens is that Molly, the first flip, Molly starts to realize almost immediately that she really wants to take care of herself. And in a variety of ways, she wants to take care of herself. And Josiah's mother realizes that this is the first step toward her independence. Her desire for independence is an important first step along the path to healing. Work is curative, Mrs. Robb says. She's very New England, and this is she's a very kind of Puritan, and I love her. She's a great character. And so what happens is that Molly needs to feel useful. Molly needs active agency. And so we take the passive damsel in distress, and the story demands that really she actually needs to do something with her life. She needs to take the first step toward healing. And in order to do this, Mrs. Robb tells her son, don't court her. Shut your trap. Don't say a thing. And by the way, if she's ready, because she's in a bad spot, she said, by the way, if she's ready, let her make the first move. Now, this is the 18th century. And this is, like I said, type A, knight in shining armor. Boy, this rubs right against the skin. And so she basically takes away his active agency. And he doesn't really have a good argument against this because she is in a bad spot. Molly is in a bad spot. And so he goes, he's a sailor, he goes off to sea, undeclared, nothing going, the things are the same as they are, but he leaves them there, and of course all hell breaks loose while he's gone. But the point being is that we flip the trope, right? You've got the damsel in distress. The damsel in distress has no way of acting for herself. The knight in shining armor acts for himself, and now we flip it, and now the knight in shining armor is passive, the damsel in distress is active. She needs active agency. Well, this is not going to sit well, because the thing is, folks, is if you take away somebody's active agency, it's dehumanizing. So we flip the trope again. Eventually, Josiah, he realizes that, wait a second, I can still court her, I just have to do it in a different way. And so we flip the trope again. He regains his agency, but he does it in a way that preserves and respects her agency. So now we have two agents, two double agents. They're complementary, they're both active. The trope flips another time when there's a moment in the book where it's at the breakup scene. There's always a breakup scene. In this case, they're not breaking up, they're just fighting. And we have a sort of, what is a divine moment, a kind of intervention. And Josiah realizes his powerlessness in the face of all of these issues and all of the places where they're at. And this powerlessness that he realizes, and he finally comes to accept the power in powerlessness. And so his agency is taken away again, but it's also it's taken away again in such a way that it leaves him with a sort of active agency that is the acknowledgement of faith. And this gives him the ability to make a self-sacrifice, which is that proof of love. And so he acts out of faith, he makes the self-sacrifice, and in the end, we flip it one more time. Molly actually does eventually vanquish the rival from a fainting couch, quite literally. And then it flips one more time, and Josiah gets to actually do the knight in shining armor, but in a way that respects God's providence, in a way that even he doesn't know entirely. It's unpremeditated, and he doesn't even know all of what he's saying. What he's saying and what she's hearing are two different things. So it really is, we flip it multiple times. So we flip it 4 times. And the flips, what they do is they respect the human person every time you flip it. So if the original trope, which is damsel in distress, this girl has no power of her own, this girl has no agency, this is kind of less than human. If that bugs you, okay, we flipped it again. Okay, well now he's less than human somehow, Okay, well, flip it again. It respects all of these things. You end up with complementary double agency, where they are both walking side by side in a complementary way and working their way toward love and mutual self-giving. I feel like if you are Catholic, you will get that joke. And that is what Catholicism has to offer to the romance genre. That was very long, sorry.
This is going to be a lot darker. One of the defining characteristics of the Gothic, if not the most defining convention, is the presence of the numinous, usually in the form of the preternatural. And there are a lot of dramatic atmospherics, and those build up suspense, but they're all working around the presence of something that is beyond the natural, something that's weird, something mysterious, and usually, at least potentially, very, very, very monstrous. Now, we can see this from the beginning of the rich genre, sort of like with the mystery fiction, which it emerged in the late 1700s. Gothic fiction was largely a reaction against the philosophical developments from what we know as the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. All that is in existence is observable through human reason. All conclusions can be achieved through the scientific method, neoclassical architecture, columns, symmetry, as opposed to the Gothic. I told Jared the beautiful chapel, it could have been part of my talk. Now, the Gothic genre reacted, the proto-romantics and the romantics themselves were reacting on behalf of the weird, on behalf of the grotesque and the mysterious. The poet William Blake wrote in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, "How do you know but every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight, closed to your senses 5. And this is his painting of Newton, who, as you see, is so focused on his scientific experimentation, he doesn't see the beauty behind him. What is beyond the senses and what is beyond reason itself? The solution to the Gothic mystery cannot be achieved through reason because the Gothic defies reason. This is The Sleep of Reason Produces Nightmares by Goya. Ghosts, ghouls, vampires, werewolves, demons, zombies, all are capturing the preternatural other, the nightmares that are beyond empirical science, and therefore reflect back on the psychological and spiritual fragility of the protagonist himself. So the drama of the Gothic is a mirror. It's like a funhouse mirror. It's super weird, but it reflects the inner corruption of the protagonist and his need for grace. And the presence of that grace is critical because it represents the possibility of redemption. It's not just nihilism in a modern slasher horror flick. I can't watch those. They scare the bejeebus out of me. In classic Gothic, when a deep moral question is at play, and it usually is, there has to be a sense that good could triumph, whether it does or not. Now, this is all heavy stuff. Life and death, damnation, redemption, and usually with a straight face. There's a self-consciousness about the Gothic. You'll often have characters talking about their own conventions and tropes. This is the sort of thing that happens in very silly novels. This is so unbelievable. I don't believe it. I'm a man of science, but let me tell you, I experienced it. Therefore, you should trust me, right? And the outrageousness of the content is driving these characters into these defenses. Why else would the moderately hysterical ranks of the anti-Dracula combatants spend the entire novel assembling this quasi-scientific dossier of evidence of our anti-vampire labors to prove we are not nuts? Because we're Englishmen, after all. And we can contrast the genres that are really close to the Gothic. For example, the Victorian sensation novel. I have this image of the werewolf here because reading Wilkie Collins' Woman in White with college students who were convinced that the solution was the villain's a werewolf. No. The solution in the sensation novel, it's got all the trappings of the Gothic, but the solution to the mystery is psychological or social. Early detection has a lot of elements of the Gothic. But the solution to the mystery is going to be from a chain of concrete evidence. Remember Knox's second commandment, which I know you all have by heart by now. All supernatural or preternatural agency must be ruled out as a matter of course. It can be present, but it's got to be eradicated by human reason. You can also contrast the innumerable Victorian novels that utilize Gothic atmospherics, Gothic conventions and tropes, or novels that want to domesticate the Gothics, like the Brontes. Deep Gothic sensibilities. Can we resolve this inner conflict of your Protestant values and reading too much of the Romantics as a child? You can also contrast novels like Dickens's Bleak House. Is it a Gothic novel? Is it a detective story? Is it a deep social commentary? Is it all of the above? You can see where the editors of critical editions are going with their interpretation based on the cover. Gothic novel, social commentary. There's also the feminist cover, frequently, for Bleak House. So here are the Gothic tropes. I'm not going to get into many of them. It's the desire to convey the preternatural other. How do we do it? Many of these will work, but I'm just going to discuss one, which is my favorite, and I've been working on this for 20 years. Did it mess up my, yeah, you can't see them, they got squashed. Scary papists. The contorted Catholic aesthetic that operates through English Gothic literary history, it's actually all over the Victorians. They love it. They like to aestheticize Catholicism, appropriate all its cool accessories, themes, characters, but make sure you spend the entire time counterbalancing it with a really well-articulated anti-Catholicism. Charlotte Bronte drives herself nuts, and it's so much fun. And this is based on 300 years of disenfranchisement, repression, prejudice. It's what John Henry Cardinal Newman called a tradition floating on the air. That's the takeaway from a very long paragraph where he talks about all the ways anti-Catholicism influences English culture and society in the Victorian period. How pervasive it was to every aspect of English life. There's a reason this is hilarious. and please tell me you know what it is. My high school students didn't. We had to stop class. It was so upsetting. We had to go watch the skit. Is that the legacy of anti-Catholicism influences us as well. We recognize it, we see it, and hopefully, well, my go-to is to think it's absolutely hilarious. The Gothic is the prime breeding ground for the English papist horrors. We're operating in a highly reasonable, post-Enlightenment world. We're assaulted by demons. Brandish your crucifix. You want to have a sense that there's the supernatural there, but it's also sort of creepy. Bring on the nuns. How do we show it? Van Helsing calls London the place of most promise to Dracula. Why? Because it is teeming with highly enlightened, vaguely agnostic Englishmen who can't handle monsters because they don't think they exist, and they threw all the Catholics out. But in the Gothic novel, they bring it back. Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, super weird, first Gothic novel, not Catholic, he was very English, but it's cast in 16th century Italy, and is presented as a manuscript that's found in the ancient home of an English Catholic family. I mean, so the Catholics would have this story, right? Matthew Gregory Lewis's The Monk, it's vile. It's really badly written. It was so bad that it almost undermined the questionable respectability of the Gothic novel. But it's about a sexually profligate papist monk who goes around assaulting females and doing all sorts of menacing things. The Catholic as the atmospheric other is someone thoroughly un-English, someone threatening and hypersexed, sometimes someone who is eminently and dysfunctionally desirable. Re-enter Charlotte Bronte. Charlotte loves a hyper-Catholic hero. Usually he's brooding and abusive and needs therapy. But the angst that this provokes for her very staunchly Protestant heroines is delicious. Bram Stoker is the most exuberant, non-anxious manipulator of the Catholic aesthetic, and he's a perfect contrast to his frantic characters. They spend a lot of time saying, well, we really need all this Catholic stuff to get rid of the vampires. Please use it and get it out of here because we're Englishmen. We don't have that sort of thing here. Early in the novel, there's a very famous scene. Jonathan Harker is given a rosary or a crucifix. Bram Stoker sort of, not very clear, a lot. This peasant woman in Romania says, here, take it with you to Count Dracula's castle. And he doesn't want it. But when he starts seeing creepy things like Count Dracula freaking out when he cuts himself and there's blood, yeah, he's terrified. And he holds onto the crucifix and he says, it is odd that a thing which I have been taught to regard with disfavor and as idolatrous should in a time of loneliness and trouble be of help. Is it there that there is something in the essence of the thing itself, or that it is a medium, a tangible help in conveying memories of sympathy and comfort? Sometime, if it may be, I must examine this matter and try to make up my mind about it. He doesn't bother. He just gets rid of the crucifix when the vampire's gone. You don't need it anymore. Later on, this is what you see here, Van Helsing produces a host and he mashes it into putty to seal the tomb of a vampire. When he explains what he's doing, the Englishmen freak out. And this is the quote you have here. It was an answer that appalled the most skeptical of us, that he has the host. And as we felt individually that in the presence of such earnest purpose as the professor's, a purpose which could thus use the, to him, most sacred of things, it was impossible to distrust. Okay, well, distrust away, good fellows, because that's monstrous. It's sacrilege. It also materially alters the substance, so it probably would lose its efficacy. But anyway, the point is that they're projecting it all onto Van Helsing and bringing it in from overseas. We don't have that sort of thing here. We need it for this, but we don't have it here. Why was Stoker so comfortable? I think it's because he was a Protestant Irishman. He grew up around the Catholics. He wasn't as uptight as the English. And he might have had a burgeoning papist in his own home. His wife converted shortly after the publication of Dracula. Where are the scary papists in my books? My own work is awash with Catholics. I mean, look at the cover. Just can't get away from it. But they represent the metaphysical, sacramental, preternatural otherness and non-Catholic anxiety about it. I have them both. So it's like having the trope and then using it to torture your characters. In my first, it torture's wrong, I'm sorry. In my first Gothic novel, A Bloody Habit, I have an extremely rational, very anti-Catholic narrator who doesn't believe in vampires. But he's possibly more terrified by the English Dominicans who were killing the vampires. So this is a serious problem for him, and he totally goes off the deep end. It's very fun. He needs my Dominican vampire slayers. They have the tools. They have the know-how. And they can handle even a semi-bureaucratized, sophisticated vampirism, which has a much better plot than Count Dracula. Is the goal of this encounter, or both encounters, to catapult my protagonist into conversion? No. No. The point is to bring him face to face with the other and provoke some glimmer of introspective growth. Remember, it's that funhouse mirror. Oh dear. In Brother Wolf, the dynamic is quite different, but I'm still playing with this trope. Oh, do you want to go to Daddy? In Brother Wolf, I'm so sorry. In Brother Wolf, Athena Howard has been raised in a world devoid of enchantment, and her father has rejected the supernatural and the preternatural. He's given her a very dull academic existence. So she's introduced to blood via werewolf hunting papists. It's fascinating, it's thrilling, it's the most wonderful thing that's ever happened to her, and it's extremely dangerous. So it forces her, that funhouse mirror again, to look inwardly, not at her own monstrousness, but to unpack her complicated relationship with her somewhat monstrous father, and to address aspects of herself fulfilling that requirement, that convention, that by encountering the other, the self will be illuminated. And whether that illumination shows forth corruption or inner beauty, find the book, read it and find out, and then send me what you thought. All right, what is the satisfactory story? Just summing up for the two of us. This is a quote from Sherlock Holmes in the study of Scarlet. In Scarlet, there's the scarlet thread of murder running through the colorless skein of life, and our duty is to unravel it and isolate it and expose every inch of it. That's the job of the detective, according to Sherlock Holmes. What's the job of the author? I think we can find an answer in Edgar Allan Poe's Philosophy of Composition, where he says, "Nothing is more clear than that every plot worth the name must be elaborated to its denouement, $100,000 word, before anything be attempted with the pen. It is only with the denouement constantly in view that we can give a plot its indispensable air of consequence or causation by making the incidents, and especially the tone, at all points, tend to the development of the intention." All right, so we'll unpose that a little bit and make it clear. What's the denouement? It's a French word that literally means the unknotting. So if you think about a plot as the knots, all the conventions and the flipping that Rhonda's talking about, satisfaction requires its unknotting in one way or another. And when we approach a genre and recognize its conventions and tropes, we are equipped as a reader or as a writer to utilize that knowledge in engaging with a vivid and engaging story. In an odd way, this process is a reflection of itself. Authors, as Rhonda pointed out, we don't set out mechanically to put in this convention, and now we will insert the requisite number of tropes. We can't tell a story without conventions and tropes because they're a means of communicating essential human realities, and in a way that is intelligible. While Rhonda and I were preparing for this talk, we had a lot of aha moments back and forth. Even just before dinner tonight, I went, I should be looking at romance conventions and figuring out which ones I used in my novel, but not doing that tonight because there are 13 pages. The author has a story to tell, and in my experience, she does it best when she gets out of the way. The story is most rich and most true when it expresses the universals that are, as Rhonda noted, behind the mechanics of convention and beyond even our imagination. When we recognize the conventions and tropes, we're really recognizing the universals, and perhaps we learn finally what our books are really about, because we're just the authors after all. Thank you. Is my baby an angel? Yes, the answer is my baby is an angel. Anybody brave?
Thank you so much for the presentation. Super interesting. I'm maybe going to ask a question about sort of genealogies. So I was very interested about the question of when does the detective sort of genre begin, and maybe sort of romance genres as well. I work a lot with sort of ancient literature, and recently I've sort of been playing around with the idea that Sophocles, the Oedipus Rex, might be the first detective stories. You've got the dead body at the beginning, you've got an ecological disaster, you've got how to figure this out, but it breaks Knox's rule because the detective is the criminal. So how do you see these sort of later modernish sort of genres relative to ancient sort of predecessors and things like that?
I think it's an excellent question. And the beautiful thing there is he's playing right into the detective. Is the detective fallible? Is he driven by his emotions? Or he is, as I said, he's a transcendent genius who is pursuing the logical, conclusions. If you read Poe, he actually stops and does a series of logical proofs. It's really boring. So I think that most of these early writers were extremely well read. So they would have read Sophocles. They would recognize the classical conventions. It's sort of like approaching the romance trope. When I'm teaching Jane Austen, we start out with, is this a comedy or is it a tragedy? And then we go back and say, well, what is a comedy? What's a tragedy? It's not what you think it is. So I think that for many writers who were contributing heavily to the emergence of our genres, they were extremely well read and informed about those early writers. As I said, Dorothy L. Sayers, who wrote amazing things about detective fiction, is frequently drawing in Aristotle. I think she even has one. Might not be Oedipus, but she does something with one of the ancient Greek plays. So there's a preoccupation there too. Did you want anything? It's also a splendid drama. Prefer the writings of Aeschylus myself, but we'll take Sophocles too.
Well, and actually, just to add on to that, one of the unintended, or one of the intended or unintended effects of flipping a trope is humor, and you see that with Aristophanes, with the plays of Aristophanes, where he's basically poking fun of the ancient, so the clouds, right? He's making fun of Socrates and his whole school, and it is playing with a trope that's in their culture, or what he thinks is a trope, and that is for the sake of humor. So I think you see a lot of that, like kind of trope flipping in things like Mel Brooks movies, and stuff like that.
Yeah. So there's nothing new under the sun, just slightly less eloquently expressed.
So how does a student get a classical education, since you reference a lot of the classics that seem to be a common thread in well-written books? So how do students get that today? Because a liberal arts education isn't really a liberal arts education anymore. I mean, I think it's more difficult to get a true liberal arts education in the classic sense.
Jared.
Well, actually, I think we both came to it in different ways.
Yeah.
So let me flex my nerd muscles. I'm a graduated homeschooler, and great books. You see, yeah, power. We do succeed in life, my friends. And we're not afraid of people. We actually will talk your ear off, given the chance. So great books was worked into the curriculum at home. Mm-hmm. But I know Rhonda did great books in college. I know my husband, you find your way there in various times, and even if you aren't getting, strictly speaking, a great books education, you can start reading now and just never stop, because that's the beauty of those works. Just when you start reading, they can become really addictive. Personally, to supplement what my mother was doing for us, I printed off a list of every important book when I was about 16 and decided to read them all. I stopped with like about 20 to spare. And then I went to college, and who has time to read? So print off your list. Print off your list now. Well, not now, after college. After college, print off your list and start reading. Supplement what you've already read.
I went to public school, not a homeschooler. And I think for me, I mean, this is, I think, really just the right people in the right place at the right time. I was introduced, actually, Austen really was my gateway drug into books bigger than myself, I guess. I would just put it that way. And I did, and then I had a couple good teachers who were able to recommend. I went to St. John's College in Annapolis, which is the original Great Book School, if there's anybody on this recording later. Sorry. Anyway, and just happened to be in the right place, and the right people encouraged me in the right places. At St. John's, it took me about a year and a half to actually learn how to read. I say that. I was a valedictorian in high school. I did not know how to read a book. I knew how to skim, and I knew how to regurgitate answers. I was very good at that. And I enjoyed certain kinds of books, but not others. And it took a long time to develop reading skills. That was probably the first and probably the most humbling experience of having to go through with education, was stopping and actually learning how to carefully read a book.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
it was bad.
That's actually, I would say that's one, so I teach high school classes for Homeschool Connections, and I will tell you, very, very able students, but we read all sorts of things, from Jane Austen to the Gothic. And the point of reading the Gothic is so you can learn how to read. So you can be having a grand old time. It can be highly entertaining, but to learn how to read deeply, how to engage with the text, how to love reading, and for it to be enjoyable again. So I think that's another thing. When you're able to fall in love and find it enjoyable, it's...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the other thing, too, is recognizing that certain books are for certain times. So when I was pregnant with our fourth, I was 9 months pregnant, and if those of you in here who have ever had children know that the 9th month of pregnancy is about 18,000 years long and full of emotion. It's very highly temperamental. And the only thing I wanted to read, I binge read Agatha Christie because it didn't demand anything of me, but it was highly logical, which I was not.
Yeah.
So I needed something to counterbalance my own 9 month status. So I mean, it was even just recognizing that different books serve a purpose for different times. That would not have been the time to tackle something like Kristen Lavren's Daughter, which is amazing and epic and beautiful. She also, I mean, it's highly tragic, and it's just not the right book for that season.
And there might be some classics you don't like. Rhonda took 2 classes on Moby Dick. Couldn't finish it. Couldn't handle. I have a very high tolerance for very long books. I read the Victorians. I cannot finish Moby Dick. And I have 5 small children, like the Ortizes, although they've got the 6 on the way. I'm not going to attempt Moby Dick anytime. I'm going to be reading things that make me happy, and Moby Dick does not. Doesn't make her happy either.
Oh, yeah.
I have a very frothy question. As readers of your particular genres as well as writers, do you have any tropes that you particularly enjoy reading? And do you have any that drive you crazy and you wish would die and you would never have to read ever again?
Action girl. Oh, it drives me nuts. It drives me nuts. I have 5 brothers. Feels patronizing. Sorry, don't need to be able to fight them physically. I can outthink them so much better because they're the ones losing their minds over there. But yeah, action girl. Action girl fills me with fury. I don't know, which is yours, damsel in distress? I can handle a damsel in distress.
I wrote damsel in
Fine.
distress.
Well-
That's the weirdest thing. How did I was like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, I wrote it. That was me. I can't think of. I think I'm kind of with Eleanor on Action Girl, mostly because I just don't think it's realistic, and because I don't need to fight kung fu to be a fulfilled human being. But that's me. But I think the one I really, really, actually, here's what I do detest, is the marriage of convenience plot. In the marriage of convenience plot, if you don't know this one, this is when, usually somebody's pregnant and she needs a husband really fast. There's some reason to need a husband, and she gets married to some nice guy who, wants to save her honor, and then eventually they have to work their way to love. Now, the thing is that they're already married, so this has to look like, it's usually just fraught with sexual tension. It's just about sex. And what's funny, it's hard to do it well in such a way that I feel like it's actually at anything except an animalistic level. It's almost every single marriage of convenience plot I've read is like that. And what's even funnier is that one of my characters in the series actually does end up in a marriage of convenience. And so now I'm like, oh crap. Why?
Well, as you've been talking, I've been realizing there's actually something I hate more than Action Girl. Vampires are sexy. Predators are not sexy, all right? It's not, you're going to flip the Twilight is just, first of all, it's deleterious smut, but second, and badly written, but it's just such a bad idea. Love changes the super bad boy, and somehow it's just ridiculous. And I'm sorry, it's toxic and is not permitted in my house. Same with Vampire Diaries. Okay, your villains are villains. Your vampires are evil. They're undead, sorry, damned, and on their, But, so yeah, that's another one that gets me. So whenever I give presentations to high schoolers, they'll be like, have you read Twilight? I'm like, let me tell you about Twilight, dearie. Yeah, so yeah, and that's one that won't make it, and I don't think it could possibly end up in one of my books.
When I taught 7th grade literature years and years ago, I did ban Twilight. It was right at the height of Twilight.
It's just...
And my administrator was like, what on earth are you? You're crazy, woman. I was like, I'm banning it from my classroom. I don't care.
Good on you. It's just you're saving society.
Well, I don't know. Yeah. So yeah, obviously Eleanor and I are thinking along the same track.
We're also raising, boys and girls, but daughters, come on. So when your daughter's been reading Twilight and she thinks the bad boy is, anyway.
Here's the thing with Twilight. Here's the thing with Twilight. The thing with Twilight is at the end of the first book, I did read the first book. At the end of the first book, she's begging him to change her nature into his nature while she has a broken leg and is dancing on his feet. So he's literally carrying her, and she's begging him to change her into him, to something like him. And I'm like,
toxicity much?
Yeah.
and bad writing. It's toxicity
I don't
plus...
teach my daughters this.
Yeah, toxicity plus bad writing. It's just unforgivable. It's ridiculous.
We have strong opinions.
What do I like?
Dickens.
Dickens, Austen. Moral growth of the heroine. I'm actually a fan of the hero inspiring intellectual growth. It's the knightly Emma dynamic. It's also the Henry Tilney and Catherine dynamic. I really thought my students would rebel against it. They were more upset about cousin marriage. But really, having the docility of the heroine, not to be formed Svengali-like, but to grow. And because then you move towards friendship in the relationship. That's a very satisfying trajectory for me. I don't know that I've written it, though. I'd have to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's also very tied to a specific historical period, right? Because, when you're thinking of it with Austen, it's the husband would have had an education. And
yes, much more experience.
And the wife, no education. And she would also be considerably younger. There's usually something of an age gap, so...
And that does contribute. So, and I should confess, I don't read things past 1940 except for Chrism Press publications, unless I have to. I'm a Victorianist by all stamps.
Any other questions?
Also, transformative arc that ends in physical transformation. You see this in the Gothic a lot. The hero is fallible, and to reach redemption, he has to be basically beat into smithereens. Tim Powers does this in his novels. He actually physically mutilates them usually, and then a great Catholic author. Absolutely addictive writer. Oh, one thing I haven't mentioned. If you want to look up on my website, by October 31st, I'm pulling a name for a giveaway that includes signed copies of my books and Tim Powers' books, and our mutual friend Karen Yulo, her vampire book. So it's called the Never Sleep Again giveaway. But Tim Powers, you start that book, you will not finish. You will not be able to finish or go to sleep until you finish, because you will be so immersed in the trajectory of this redemptive arc. That's pretty fabulous. Good stuff.
I'm going to cheat and ask 2 questions here. So the first question is, how did you two decide, or discern would be the proper word, that you needed to write stories for people? And secondly, how have you seen the true, the good, and the beautiful come through in your work, particularly in your respective genres?
You want to go first?
Sure. Jared hinted a little bit or briefly mentioned this. I never set out, I think, consciously to write fiction. I've written a lot of nonfiction, and then after the birth of our first, something through a very series of life changes, I had an idea for a story which is written in it's horrible, by the way, because it's the first. But it was a surprise. It was a real surprise, but it was also a real lifesaver for me. And interestingly, there's a lot of vocational questions around writing generally, around life generally, because, I taught school for the first 5 years of our marriage. It took us a long time to have children. We didn't think we were going to have children, and I think at some point it was like, I need something to do with my life for the waking hours of my day. I cannot sit around like hoping for things to happen. Then we had Benedict, our oldest, and then writing came around as a sort of surprise post-baby. And it's been really lovely. It's lovely personally for me because it dovetails nicely with being a mom to a certain degree. Our house is a lot louder now that we have more kids, so I do have to fight a little harder for quiet time, or I just ignore them. I'm good at that. So turning it to writing, I think writing popular fiction, I think for myself, I only aspire to write the best story I can possibly write. I don't think I'm a genius. I think I'm smart enough to write a story. I do not claim anything higher than that. And I really like having fun. And so I'm okay with that. I've actually kind of accepted my place in the echelon. What my goal when writing, as I kept telling people this while I was drafting the book, my goal was, okay, so so for the romance genre, there's Austen over here, and there's the Fabio covers over here, and I'm going to aim for Austen and hope I land in the middle. And I think I did land in the middle. It is definitely pop fiction. And there's certain things that are unique to certain characteristics of my own that come out. I write dialogue. I like dialogue. I like action. I think I'm allergic to descriptive writing. I'm really, really working on it. It's okay to write long paragraphs, Rhonda. So there are things that are there. But yeah, that it reads at a very pop level, but it's intelligible and intelligent. So at that level. So I'm grateful for that. There was something else I was going to say, but I don't remember what it was. So.
Well, and for me, stories have always been part of my life. My mother's a voracious reader, so as soon as my whole childhood was stories, and as soon as I could write, I was writing stories. And they were dreadful. I'm not Jane Austen, so my juvenilia will not be in volume form unless somebody finds a computer, and that would just be like, do we have, early ones, there weren't computers that we had in our house. I mean, that's how old I am. But constantly writing, and actually when I was in graduate school and had sort of taken a hiatus from writing because I was getting English degrees and who can write, I started writing again as a sort of form of self-imposed therapy, and then I couldn't stop. And I find it very delightful, a personal outlet, but the stories, I write because the stories are there. I write because the characters are in my head. I write because there are scenes that I have to put down and then work with readers, with my editors, and just sort of flesh it out to see if this is a story that's really, if it finishes, and balancing that with the vocation of motherhood and seeing the call to write the true, the good, and beautiful, even in a pop genre. It's a constant negotiation, and this is something Rhonda and I have talked about, and anyone who has artistic ambition, you're always balancing it with saying, this is for God, and if it's for God, it's for Him. If I finish it, great. If it goes someplace, great. If it doesn't, that also has to be great. So that the love of the writing and the love of the story and the delight of the story, even if it doesn't end in publication, which is really fun, is all right too, because it's storytelling and it's enlivening, and it's a way that I find, it's my funhouse mirror too. I find moral growth and just entertainment that doesn't have a Fabio cover because, yeah, yeah, it's like, I want to like myself. Can't. And because I love to read. And one of the happiest things for me as a parent is seeing my children fall in love with literature and then try to sculpt their own stories. And to watch them playing with conventions and tropes and realizing, ooh, you haven't read a mystery novel, but you've heard enough pieces that you know where to put the body. It's really, not literally, no dead bodies in the house, even though I told Rhonda this entire trip feels like a series of murder tropes. Could have been murder on the airplane, could have been murder in the cottage. There's a spiral staircase, should be a dead body in the basement. So when you start thinking about tropes, you see them everywhere. No.
Yeah, and I think, I'm just thinking about moral growth. This is actually something that would address your true, good, and beautiful, and that is the writing of this novel in particular. And I have, several junk drafts of other novels. This is the first one where I was like, this is going somewhere, but it's also the first one where I think I took critique better I simply accepted critique, or I put it out for critique. But what ended up happening through it was that because it's a love story, and because, in a love story, oftentimes you do take the man's point of view. So there's some gender stuff that goes into it where I'll be writing a scene and I'm like, this is just not working. The scene is just not coming together. And I go to Jared and I'm like, what's going on with the scene? So we talk through it and he would just look at me and be like, nah, dude wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And you're like, I'd be seething mad at him for 30 minutes.
Yeah.
I'd stalk off. And then about 30 minutes later, I'd be like, all right, so what would a dude do? Yeah. So it helped. And what's interesting is that it really did help, it helped the growth in marriage just on a personal level. We really, was like, oh, that's what, now I get it. Okay, and so I started understanding those things, and that was really lovely.
You also see your response to people. I was jokingly saying something to someone before, one of our fellow authors who was here in this audience. I was saying something to her. I said, yeah, a realization that I killed a friend 4 different ways in a book. And it was nothing personal. He just kept coming out in different ways and and not entirely, but then the characters are evolving. And this is the consequence of your actions is going to lead to brutal dismemberment by a werewolf, probably. This is a warning to all readers, and don't make me mad. So you find you're working through relationships like Rhonda said, you're growing personally, and just because the story's there. And I hope there are more stories there. I think there are more stories there because it's delightful.
Yeah, it is delightful.
Thank
you for having us.